In the summer of 1873, the territorial newspapers that occasionally reached the mountain settlement of Copper Hollow carried, among their usual accounts of railroad expansion and mining claims, a curious item that most readers dismissed as an exaggeration unworthy of serious attention. A report that the steamship Amelia Rose, once the pride of the high mountain lake trade that had briefly flourished before the railroad's arrival rendered such water transport largely obsolete, now sat entirely marooned, some 50 miles from the nearest navigable water, in a mountain valley whose lake had vanished so completely and so suddenly that the settlement nearest the abandoned vessel had spent the better part of 2 years disputing among themselves exactly what natural catastrophe could account for so considerable a body of water simply disappearing. Eleanor Vance read this account with considerably more attention than most, having spent the previous decade of her life in the particular circumstance of a widow whose late husband's modest estate, tied up in careful legal complications following his death from a mining accident 3 years earlier, had left her with sufficient patience for careful research, but precious little capital for any venture requiring substantial upfront investment. She had, in those 3 years since her husband's death, developed something of a reputation in Copper Hollow as a woman of unusual and occasionally impractical curiosity, spending long hours in the settlement's modest lending library, working through geological surveys and territorial records that her neighbors generally regarded as considerably beyond the proper interests of a respectable widow still, in their careful estimation, expected to be primarily occupied with the business of securing a second, more practical marriage. The account of the stranded Amelia Rose captured her attention specifically because of a detail the newspaper had mentioned almost in passing, buried near the article's conclusion: that the vessel's original owner, a shipping company that had gone bankrupt in the aftermath of the lake's mysterious disappearance, had recently placed the abandoned steamship up for public auction, the territorial court having determined that the company's remaining assets, including whatever recoverable value the marooned vessel still possessed, sitting useless in its dried mountain valley, needed to be liquidated to satisfy the company's considerable outstanding debts. Eleanor understood, reading this account with the same careful attention she brought to every piece of research that captured her curiosity, that a steamship stranded 50 miles from any navigable water represented, to any conventional business calculation, an asset of essentially negligible value, a vessel built specifically for water transport, that could serve no practical purpose whatsoever in its current landlocked circumstance, its considerable original cost now representing little more than a curious monument to a disappeared lake and a bankrupt company's poor fortune. It was precisely this apparent worthlessness that drew her careful attention, understanding, from years of following her late husband's own mining ventures, and the particular way frontier fortunes could sometimes be made from assets that conventional wisdom dismissed too quickly as valueless. She traveled, within the week of reading that newspaper account, to the territorial capital where the auction was to be conducted, carrying with her the modest remaining capital her husband's estate had finally, after years of legal complication, released to her sole ownership. The auction itself, when she attended it some 10 days later, proved considerably less contested than she had anticipated. The assembled bidders, a handful of scrap merchants interested primarily in the vessel's iron fittings and machinery, and a scattering of curious speculators who seemed drawn more by the story's novelty than any genuine business calculation, showing little enthusiasm for a steamship whose practical value seemed, to every conventional assessment, limited entirely to whatever its component parts might fetch once properly dismantled and hauled back down from its remote mountain stranding. Eleanor secured the Amelia Rose for a sum that, while representing a considerable portion of her modest remaining capital, struck the auction's other attendees as an almost inexplicable overpayment for a vessel, most of them regarded as worth considerably less than the effort required to properly salvage its parts, let alone the additional expense of transporting anything recovered back to a market where it might actually be sold. "You understand," the auctioneer told her, once the transaction was properly completed, his tone carrying the particular careful concern of a man uncertain whether he was witnessing genuine business acumen or simple foolishness, "that the vessel sits in a location considerably remote from any proper road, in mountain country, that has proven, in the 2 years since the lake's disappearance, difficult even for the curious to properly reach. Whatever purpose you intend for your purchase, ma'am, I would counsel careful consideration of exactly how you intend to make practical use of a steamship so thoroughly isolated from any water that might actually float it." "I have given the matter considerable thought," Eleanor said, with a confidence that concealed, if only barely, her own genuine uncertainty about exactly what practical value her unusual purchase might ultimately yield. "I do not intend to sail the vessel, Mr. Pemberton. I intend to properly examine it, and the peculiar circumstances of the lake's disappearance, before determining what value it might actually represent, beyond the conventional salvage assessment your other bidders were apparently satisfied to accept." She arranged, in the weeks that followed, for a guide familiar with the mountain valley's difficult approach. A weathered prospector named Amos Hale, who had spent considerable years working claims throughout that particular range, and had, by his own account, visited the stranded vessel on several occasions, out of the same curiosity that had first drawn Eleanor's attention to the newspaper account. "Strangest thing I ever did see," Amos told her, as their small pack train made its careful way up the difficult mountain trail toward the valley where the Amelia Rose had sat marooned for the better part of 2 years. "That lake was there my whole life, ma'am, fed by snowmelt off the high peaks the way mountain lakes generally are, deep enough in most places to float a vessel the size of the Amelia Rose without any particular difficulty. Then, near enough 2 years back now, it simply began to drain, over the course of maybe 3 or 4 weeks, until there weren't nothing left but the dry lake bed you're about to see for yourself, and that poor steamship sitting stranded right where the water left it." "What do the local prospectors believe caused the drainage?" Eleanor asked, understanding that a man of Amos's considerable practical experience in that particular mountain country might offer insight considerably more valuable than the speculative newspaper accounts that had first captured her attention. "Plenty of theories," Amos said, guiding his mule around a particularly difficult switchback with the unhurried competence of long practice. "Some folks reckon an earthquake opened up some manner of underground channel that drained the lake off through the mountain itself, into some cavern system nobody's ever properly mapped. Others say it's simple as a natural dam somewhere upstream finally giving way after years of erosion, releasing all that water down into the valley below faster than the lake could naturally replenish itself. I've heard talk of stranger explanations too, from the more superstitious sort, though I confess I've never put much stock in those particular stories myself." "What sort of stranger explanations?" Eleanor asked, her curiosity considerably piqued by Amos's careful hesitation. "There's a story," Amos said, his tone shifting into something closer to reluctant amusement, "about the lake having been fed by more than simple snowmelt, about there being something in the deeper caverns beneath that particular stretch of mountain that the local tribes, before this territory was properly settled, were said to have given the whole valley a wide berth on account of. I don't put much stock in it myself, ma'am, being a practical man not much given to superstition, but I confess the timing of the lake's disappearance, coming as sudden and unexplained as it did, has got even some of the more skeptical folks around these parts wondering whether there mightn't be some grain of truth buried somewhere in those old stories." Eleanor turned this information over carefully across the remainder of their difficult journey, understanding that whatever practical value her unusual purchase might ultimately yield, she had apparently also acquired, through the peculiar circumstance of a bankrupt shipping company's liquidated assets, a considerably more interesting mystery than the newspaper's brief account had initially suggested. They reached the valley itself late on the second day of their journey, and Eleanor found herself, upon first properly viewing the scene that had drawn her considerable investment and considerably more considerable curiosity, genuinely unprepared for the strange, almost eerie beauty of what had once been a substantial mountain lake, now reduced to a vast expanse of cracked, sun-baked lakebed stretching across the valley floor. The Amelia Rose, sitting marooned at its center, like some improbable monument to a catastrophe none of the valley's careful observers had yet properly explained. The vessel itself, once she approached it closely enough for proper examination, proved considerably more structurally sound than the newspaper's account of its abandonment had led her to expect. Its hull intact, despite 2 years of exposure to mountain weather. Its considerable machinery apparently undisturbed by whatever scrap merchants had presumably considered the journey too difficult, and the salvage value too modest to justify the expense of proper dismantling and transport. It was as she made her way carefully around the vessel's grounded hull, examining the peculiar angle at which it had settled into the lakebed's cracked, dried mud, that Eleanor noticed something the newspaper's account had not mentioned at all, and that Amos, for all his considerable familiarity with the site across his several previous visits, seemed genuinely startled to observe as well. A section of the exposed lakebed, some considerable distance beyond the vessel itself, where the dried mud had cracked and partially collapsed, to reveal what appeared, even from their considerable distance, to be the unmistakable opening of some manner of cavern or tunnel entrance, previously concealed beneath the lake's considerable depth, now exposed by the water's mysterious and complete disappearance. Eleanor approached the exposed opening with the particular careful curiosity that had first drawn her toward this entire unlikely venture. Amos, following a few steps behind, with an expression that suggested his considerable practical experience in that mountain country, had not fully prepared him for whatever they were about to discover. His earlier casual dismissal of the local superstitions about the valley's hidden dangers, giving way, Eleanor noticed, to a more careful, watchful attention as they drew closer to the cavern's dark opening. "I've walked this lakebed near enough a dozen times these past 2 years," Amos said, his voice carrying a note of genuine unease that had not been present during his earlier, more confident narration of the various theories surrounding the lake's disappearance. "Never once noticed this particular opening before, ma'am, and I confess I'm not entirely certain I like the notion of it having simply appeared, without any obvious explanation, between my last visit and this one." Eleanor understood his caution, and shared it to a considerable degree, but the same careful curiosity that had led her to purchase a stranded steamship most of Copper Hollow regarded as an inexplicable folly, now drew her forward toward the cavern's opening, with a determination she found herself unable to fully suppress despite Amos's evident reservations. The opening itself, once they had properly examined its edges, proved considerably more substantial than its distant appearance had initially suggested. A passage perhaps 8 feet across at its widest point, descending at a gradual angle into darkness, that their modest lantern light could not fully penetrate beyond the first 30 or 40 feet. The passage's walls showing clear evidence of having been shaped, at least in part, by the considerable weight and pressure of the lake's water, across what must have been many years of gradual erosion. Though Eleanor's careful examination also revealed sections where the passage's construction appeared considerably too regular and deliberate to represent purely natural formation. "This wasn't made entirely by water, wearing away at rock over time," she said, running her hand carefully along a section of the passage wall, where the stones showed clear tool marks, weathered by considerable age, but unmistakably deliberate in their pattern. "Someone shaped this passage, Hail, though I confess I cannot begin to guess how long ago that work might have been done, nor by whom." They proceeded carefully into the passage over the following hour, Eleanor's determination to properly understand the full extent of whatever unexpected discovery her unusual purchase had led her toward, overcoming Amos's continued careful reservations about venturing further into a cavern system neither of them had any proper preparation for exploring. The passage descended gradually deeper into the mountain, opening eventually into a series of interconnected chambers that showed increasing evidence of deliberate construction rather than purely natural formation. carved supports reinforcing sections of ceiling that might otherwise have proven unstable. Careful channels cut into the chamber floors that Eleanor recognized with growing fascination as evidence of some considerable engineering effort to manage and direct the flow of water through this particular section of the mountain's interior. It was in the third of these interconnected chambers, considerably larger than the passages that had led them there, that Eleanor and Amos finally discovered the source of both the lake's mysterious disappearance and the shocking secret that would ultimately prove considerably more significant than either of them had anticipated when they first set out on this careful investigation. The chamber contained, arranged with evident deliberate purpose along its considerable length, a series of stone channels and sluice gates, constructed with a sophistication that neither Eleanor's careful reading nor Amos's considerable practical mining experience had prepared either of them to properly explain. Apparently designed specifically to control and redirect the flow of water through the mountain's interior according to some deliberate engineering purpose that predated, by what evidence of weathering and construction style suggested, any period of settlement Eleanor was familiar with from the territory's documented history. "This is no natural cavern system," Eleanor said, examining the careful stonework with growing astonishment. "This is a deliberately engineered structure, built specifically to manage this mountain's water flow, and built by someone possessing engineering knowledge considerably more sophisticated than anything I would have expected to find in this remote territory." Amos, examining the chamber's construction with his own considerable practical experience, offered a careful, troubled assessment. "I've worked mining claims across this entire range for the better part of 20 years, ma'am, and I've never once encountered construction of this sophistication, nor heard any account, even among the oldest prospectors I've known, of anyone having built anything like this in these mountains. This work predates any mining operation I'm familiar with, predates the settlement of this territory entirely, unless I am very much mistaken about what we're looking at." Their careful examination of the chamber's sluice gates, conducted over the following several hours, with growing fascination overcoming their earlier caution, eventually revealed the apparent mechanism behind the lake's sudden and complete disappearance. A series of ancient stone gates, evidently designed to be opened and closed according to some deliberate engineering purpose that neither Eleanor nor Amos could fully reconstruct, that had apparently, through some combination of age, structural failure, or perhaps the same seismic activity Amos's earlier account of local theories had mentioned, finally given way after what must have been many years of gradual deterioration, releasing the mountain lake's considerable water down through this previously concealed passage into some deeper cavern system that neither of them had yet properly explored. "Whoever built this," Eleanor said, standing before the massive stone gates that had apparently controlled the lake's water for reasons she could not yet fully understand, possessed not simply the practical skill to construct such elaborate engineering, but some deliberate purpose in doing so. This was not built by accident, Mr. Hale. Someone wished, for reasons I cannot yet properly explain, to maintain careful control over this mountain's water flow, sufficient to construct an entire system of gates and channels capable of either maintaining or apparently eventually draining an entire lake according to their own deliberate purpose. It was as they continued their careful examination of the chamber, searching for any further evidence that might explain the purpose behind this remarkable ancient engineering, that Amos's lantern light finally revealed, in a smaller adjoining chamber they had not yet properly explored, evidence that would transform their understanding of the entire discovery from a merely remarkable feat of ancient engineering into something considerably more significant and considerably more shocking than either of them had anticipated when they first ventured into the mountain's hidden depths. The adjoining chamber, considerably smaller than the main sluice gate chamber they had spent the previous hours examining, contained what Eleanor recognized immediately, even in the uncertain light of their modest lanterns, as evidence of considerable and deliberate habitation. Carved shelving lining the chamber's walls, holding what appeared to be a substantial collection of carefully preserved artifacts, alongside a series of stone tablets covered in inscriptions, unlike any written language Eleanor had previously encountered in her considerable reading of territorial history and geological surveys. This chamber was inhabited, Eleanor said, examining the careful arrangement of preserved goods with growing astonishment. Not simply engineered as a functional water management system, but actually lived in by someone who took considerable care to preserve whatever these artifacts represent and to record whatever information these inscriptions contain. Amos, examining the strange stone tablets with an expression that mixed his considerable practical caution with genuine fascination, offered a careful observation that Eleanor found herself immediately recognizing as significant. "I've seen inscriptions before, ma'am, in some of the older mining claims across this territory, left by tribes who lived in this country long before any settlement arrived. But I confess, these don't match anything I've previously encountered, either in style or in whatever these particular symbols might mean." Eleanor spent the following several days, once she and Amos had properly returned to Copper Hollow, to secure additional supplies and equipment for a more thorough investigation, carefully documenting, and where practical, transporting samples of the chamber's remarkable contents, understanding that whatever significance this discovery ultimately held, it deserved considerably more careful, scholarly examination than her own admittedly amateur expertise could properly provide. She wrote, in the weeks that followed, to several scholarly contacts her late husband's own considerable correspondence had once maintained with various territorial universities and scientific societies, describing the discovery with careful, measured language that avoided overstating conclusions she was not yet properly equipped to draw, but that nonetheless conveyed sufficient detail about the sophisticated ancient engineering and the mysterious inscribed tablets to attract the serious scholarly attention she believed the discovery genuinely warranted. It was Professor Jonathan Reyes, a geologist and amateur archaeologist from the Territorial University, whose own published work Eleanor had encountered during her earlier research into the region's natural history, who responded to her careful correspondence with genuine scholarly interest. Traveling to Copper Hollow within a month of receiving her letter, to properly examine both the stranded Amelia Rose, which he found considerably less interesting, he admitted with some scholarly humor, than the far more significant discovery hidden beneath the vanished lake it had once floated upon, and the remarkable underground chamber system Eleanor and Amos had first discovered. "I confess," Reyes told Eleanor, some days into his careful examination of the chamber's inscribed tablets and preserved artifacts, "that I did not fully credit the significance of your correspondence until I had the opportunity to properly examine this site myself. What you have discovered here, Mrs. Vance, represents evidence of a sophisticated engineering and record-keeping tradition considerably predating any settlement this territory's documented history currently accounts for. Constructed by a culture whose presence in this particular mountain range has not, to my knowledge, been previously documented in any scholarly account I am familiar with." "What do you believe the inscriptions record?" Eleanor asked, understanding that Reyes's careful scholarly training might finally offer some proper interpretation of the mysterious symbols that had so thoroughly captured her own curiosity across the preceding weeks of careful, amateur examination. "That will require considerably more careful study than I am currently equipped to provide," Reyes admitted honestly. "But my preliminary assessment, based on comparative analysis with certain other regional inscriptions I am familiar with from my own previous research, suggests these tablets may record some manner of careful historical or ceremonial account, possibly related to the deliberate engineering purpose behind this remarkable water management system you have discovered. I would need to arrange for considerably more thorough scholarly translation before offering any confident conclusion. But I believe, Mrs. Vance, that you have stumbled upon a discovery of genuine and considerable historical significance, one that I would very much like to properly document and study, with your permission and continued collaboration." Eleanor agreed readily to Reyes's proposed collaboration, understanding that whatever practical financial value her unusual purchase of the stranded steamship had ultimately failed to yield in any conventional sense, she had acquired, through the peculiar circumstance of a bankrupt shipping company's liquidated asset, something considerably more valuable than any straightforward business calculation could have anticipated. A genuine, significant contribution to the territory's understanding of its own deep historical past, discovered entirely by accident, through her own careful curiosity and willingness to invest in an asset every conventional business assessment had dismissed as worthless. The formal scholarly investigation that followed over the subsequent months, conducted through careful collaboration between Reyes's growing team of university researchers and Eleanor's own continued practical involvement as the site's legal property owner and original discoverer, gradually revealed a story considerably more complex than either Eleanor or Amos had initially anticipated during their first careful exploration of the mysterious underground chambers. The inscriptions, once properly translated through Reyes's careful scholarly work over the following year, revealed that the ancient engineering system had been constructed by a sophisticated culture whose presence in this particular mountain range predated, by what geological dating eventually suggested, several centuries at minimum, any previously documented settlement of the region. The careful water management system Reyes's translation eventually revealed had served a purpose considerably more significant than simple practical utility. The tablets described an elaborate ceremonial tradition surrounding the mountain lake's careful, deliberate management, understood by whatever culture had constructed this system as essential to maintaining a delicate balance between the mountain's considerable water resources and the broader ecological health of the entire surrounding region. They understood something about water management and ecological balance, Reyes told Eleanor, presenting his careful translation work some months into the ongoing investigation, that our own more recent settlement of this territory has, I confess, not always properly appreciated in our own considerably less careful approach to resource management. Whatever culture built this system possessed sophisticated understanding of watershed management that predates, by considerable centuries, similar scientific understanding only now beginning to properly develop within our own contemporary engineering and geological scholarship. The years that followed this remarkable discovery's proper scholarly documentation brought Eleanor Vance a transformation considerably more significant than the modest financial calculation that had first drawn her toward the peculiar opportunity of a stranded steamship's public auction. The site itself, properly documented and preserved through careful collaboration between Reyes's ongoing university research and Eleanor's continued stewardship as the property's legal owner, became over the following years a location of genuine scholarly significance, drawing researchers and students from territorial universities eager to properly study evidence of a sophisticated ancient culture whose presence in this particular mountain range had, until Eleanor's unlikely discovery, remained entirely unknown to the broader scholarly understanding of the region's deep history. Eleanor found herself, in the years following the discovery's initial documentation, occupying a position considerably different from the careful, financially constrained widow who had first traveled to the territorial capital with her modest remaining capital and an unusual conviction that a stranded steamship might represent opportunity where conventional assessment saw only worthless salvage. She established, through careful negotiation with both the territorial university and the various scholarly societies that eventually took considerable interest in the site's ongoing study, a formal arrangement ensuring both proper scholarly access to the discovery and her own continued financial benefit from what had, quite unexpectedly, become a site of genuine historical and educational significance, drawing modest but steady income through carefully managed scholarly visits, and eventually a small museum exhibition established in Copper Hollow itself to properly display and interpret the discovery's significance for the broader public. The Amelia Rose itself, the stranded steamship whose peculiar circumstance had first drawn Eleanor's attention to the entire remarkable chain of discovery, found new purpose in the years that followed, as the centerpiece of this same museum exhibition, its considerable hull properly preserved and stabilized as a genuine curiosity in its own right. Connected, through the careful interpretive displays Eleanor helped establish, to the broader story of the ancient engineering system whose eventual failure had first stranded the vessel in its considerable mountain isolation. Amos Hale, whose considerable practical mountain experience had proven so valuable throughout the initial discovery and subsequent investigation, found himself drawn into a continued working partnership with Eleanor across the following years. His practical knowledge of the mountain range's difficult terrain proving repeatedly valuable as Rose's ongoing university research expanded to examine whether similar ancient engineering evidence might exist elsewhere across the broader mountain range. Never expected, Amos told Eleanor, some 3 years after their first careful exploration of the mysterious cavern system, the two of them standing together at the edge of the now properly documented and preserved excavation site, that hauling you up this mountain to look at a stranded steamship would end up teaching me more about this country's history than 20 years of prospecting ever managed. Reckon I owe you my thanks, ma'am, for the education, whatever else came of it. I believe, Eleanor said, watching a small group of visiting university students carefully documenting a newly discovered section of the ancient chamber system that Rose's continued excavation had uncovered that same season, that we both owe considerable thanks to whoever built this remarkable system so many centuries ago, and to whatever combination of accident and curiosity eventually led us to discover it. I confess, I purchased that stranded vessel, expecting at best some modest salvage value that might partially offset the risk of my admittedly unconventional investment. I never anticipated discovering anything remotely approaching the genuine historical significance this site has ultimately proven to hold. Professor Reyes, whose careful scholarly collaboration with Eleanor had grown, across the years of ongoing investigation, into a genuine professional partnership that occasionally drew the same curious speculation from Copper Hollow's gossiping residents that had once surrounded Eleanor's original, seemingly inexplicable purchase, found himself increasingly drawn to Eleanor's own considerable intellectual curiosity and careful, methodical approach to understanding the discovery's full significance. A shared scholarly passion that gradually deepened over the years of their continued collaboration into a partnership considerably more personal than their initial professional correspondence had first suggested. I confess, Reyes told her during one of their frequent careful discussions regarding the ongoing translation work that continued to reveal new dimensions of the ancient culture's sophisticated water management tradition, that I did not anticipate, when I first traveled to Copper Hollow to examine your admittedly unusual correspondence, that I would find myself so thoroughly and permanently drawn into both this remarkable discovery's continued study and the particular company of the woman whose curiosity first uncovered it. They married some 4 years after that first careful expedition into the mountain's hidden depths, their shared partnership continuing to oversee the site's ongoing scholarly investigation and public interpretation across the following decades. Eleanor finding herself, in her own quieter reflective moments, across those years, genuinely grateful for the particular chain of curiosity and unconventional judgment that had first led her, a widow of modest means and unconventional interests, toward a stranded steamship most of Copper Hollow had dismissed as worthless folly, and through it, toward a discovery of genuine historical significance and a partnership considerably more fulfilling than the conventional remarriage her late husband's careful acquaintances had once assumed represented her only reasonable future prospect. The dried lakebed itself, in the years that followed, gradually became something of a landmark in its own right, visited by scholars and curious travelers alike, drawn by the strange evocative sight of a stranded steamship sitting at the center of a vast expanse of cracked mountain earth, its considerable hull now permanently preserved as testament to both a bankrupt company's misfortune and the remarkable ancient discovery that misfortune had, quite by unlikely accident, ultimately revealed to a world that had, until Eleanor Vance's careful curiosity intervened, remained entirely unaware of the sophisticated culture that had once so carefully managed these mountain waters, centuries before any settlement had thought to claim this remarkable range as its own.